The first time the new CTO called me grandpa, I laughed it off. In tech, you grow a thick skin, too many fresh grads with buzzwords and too little experience. But when he stood in front of the entire engineering floor, clapped his hands, and said, "Legacy thinking slows us down. Some of you fossils won't make it to Q4," his eyes settled squarely on me. 22 years at the bank, the last surviving COBOL architect in a system older than half the staff, and suddenly I was an inconvenience to be streamlined. I knew then that he wasn't just making a joke, he was making a move. And he had absolutely no idea how bad a move it was. When the termination email came, cold, boilerplate, delivered at 11:58 p.m. on a Thursday, I didn't rage. I didn't panic. I simply closed my laptop and exhaled. They thought letting me go would trim costs and modernize the team. They forgot one key detail: the banking system that processed over $4 billion in daily transactions wasn't legacy code. It was my code. Before anyone else had arrived the next morning, I cleaned out my desk, left my badge, and walked up the revolving doors into the humid downtown air with the strange calm of someone who knows exactly how the next week will unfold. By Monday morning, the bank's transactional mainframe was already groaning under the weight of processes that had been quietly degrading for months, issues I had monitored, anticipated, and patched without fanfare. Automated batch jobs that once took 40 minutes ballooned to 3 hours. Overnight remittance files didn't clear. A small error in the interest calculation subroutine multiplied across millions of accounts. Customers flooded call centers. Branch managers panicked. And the CTO? He sent a company-wide email blaming unexpected legacy instability. I had to laugh. Legacy instability. Cute. By Tuesday, the system buckled. Not crashed, but something worse, it became unpredictable. Transfers froze halfway. Debit cards were declined randomly. End-of-day reconciliations produced numbers that made risk analysts physically ill. It wasn't sabotage. It was merely the absence of the only person who understood the logic threads and undocumented dependencies woven into a 40-year-old codebase held together by the digital equivalent of duct tape and prayer. They had built their kingdom on top of a dragon and fired the only one who knew how to pet it. Wednesday morning, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but the desperation breathing on the other end gave it away immediately. "This is Eric," the CTO said, voice tight. "We need your expertise. As a consultant. Short term." I let a beat of silence stretch. "Consultant? I'm retired, remember?" He swallowed. "Name your rate." I knew they were losing roughly $2 to $4 million per hour installed operations. I'd done the math the day I was fired. So I gave him a number that would make most attorneys faint. 20,000 per hour. He didn't hesitate. Done. And just like that, the fossil was resurrected. I walked back into the bank the next morning, not through the employee entrance, but through the front, wearing a visitor badge with consultant, executive authorization stamped in red. People stared. Some whispered. The CTO avoided eye contact as he escorted me to the war room, where 10 engineers sat surrounded by whiteboards full of chaotic diagrams, half-eaten energy bars, and despair. I surveyed the mess, cracked my knuckles, and said, "All right. Show me what you broke." Over the next 14 hours, I performed surgery. I patched recursive loops no one else understood. I rewrote sections of code that hadn't been touched since the Clinton administration. I located a memory leak hiding behind a conditional statement with a comment that simply read "fix later," written by someone who had probably died by now. Every time I explained what I was doing, jaws dropped. The CTO tried to hover until he realized he understood none of it, then retreated behind his MacBook like a child with a coloring book. By midnight, the mainframe hummed like a content animal. Transactions cleared. Balances reconciled. Cards worked. The crisis dissolved. When I finally stood to leave, the CFO approached me with the calm of someone who had made a decision. "We'd like to bring you back," she said. "Full-time. Name your salary." I shook my head. "No, thank you." The CTO exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for hours. Maybe he had. "But," I added, "I'll stay on call. Consultant only. My rate stands." They agreed. They had no choice. Their future depended on a language they mocked and a man they tried to discard. And now? I work from home, 3 hours a week, sipping coffee while old code purrs in the background, earning more in a month than the CTO does in 2. Age discrimination didn't just backfire. It paid for my early retirement. Turns out the stack migration they bragged about for months was nothing but a half-baked PowerPoint fantasy sold to the board by a consulting firm that had never touched a mainframe in their lives. They were trying to yank 48 years of transactional history off a COBOL backbone that processed $180 million a day, using interns who thought JCL was a sneaker brand. I watched silently as the new CTO, a 32-year-old with a ring light permanently mounted in his office, waved his hands and assured everyone the legacy fossil code base would be gone by Q3. He smirked when he said it. He didn't look at me once. Age discrimination doesn't always sound like an insult. Sometimes it sounds like someone predicting your extinction. The first explosion hit the following Monday. At 9:42 a.m., the East Coast settlement system froze mid-cycle. That freeze cascaded into the overnight batch window. That backed into the credit authorization queue. Within half an hour, the bank's merchant terminals were declining cards in 7 states. The CTO kept insisting it was the load balancing anomaly. The interns kept rebooting things that should never be rebooted. By noon, Treasury was on the phone demanding to know why their sweeps hadn't executed. By 1:30, the CEO was storming around the 37th floor looking for someone old enough to understand words like CICS region and record locking. Conveniently, there were very few of us left. They found me eating a sandwich in the atrium because, frankly, I was enjoying the show. HR had escorted me out the previous Thursday with a branded coffee mug and a pamphlet titled "Your Next Chapter." They hadn't deactivated my pager, though. The bank still relied on a paging system from 1998 for incident alerts nobody had bothered to migrate. So when the system failures started firing off, my pocket buzzed like a hornet's nest. That's when I knew they were going to beg. And beg they did. The CEO herself came down in person, heels clicking like gunshots, trying to look composed while every executive behind her looked like they were watching the stock price fall in real time. "We need your assistance," she said, the words clearly painful. I studied her for a moment. She was the one who signed off on replacing senior engineers with digitally native hires. She once told me she wanted fresh minds, not museum curators. I let the silence stretch until she visibly swallowed. I didn't ask for my job back. I didn't even ask for an apology. I simply named my rate, $20,000 per hour, billable in 6-hour blocks. Nobody blinked. The CTO nodded immediately, like a bobblehead tossed down a staircase. They walked me back upstairs like I was carrying the antidote to a spreading virus. When I entered the command center, the room actually applauded. I waved them off and asked them to pull up the transaction logs. 5 minutes later, I identified the exact failure, a malformed translation script the interns had pushed into production without sandboxing. It had duplicated a control character that corrupted the nightly batch chain. I fixed the offending job, rebuilt the chain, resynced the records, and restarted the settlement system. The moment the lights on the wallboard turned green again, A few people actually sighed with relief. The interns whispered like they'd just seen a ghost perform magic. The CTO asked if I could explain what you did in modern terminology. I pretended I didn't hear him. When the crisis passed, they asked if I'd return full-time. I smiled. No, I said. I've discovered I prefer charging you by the hour. And judging by the 3 new incidents waiting in my inbox, I'll be billing them for a very, very long time. The next morning, I walked into the skyscraper's marble atrium like a ghost returning to haunt the living. The HR director nearly jumped when she saw me. Apparently no one had warned her that the bank's mainframe had been coughing up error logs all night like a dying engine. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt like rising through the atmosphere after being launched from a slingshot. Nobody met my eyes. Nobody dared. That's what happens when the oldest guy in IT, the dinosaur, as they'd called me, becomes the only one who can stop a Fortune 50 bank from tearing itself apart block by block, instruction by instruction. When I stepped out onto the 58th floor, I heard shouting before I saw faces. The COO was redder than I'd ever seen, waving printouts like they were holy writ. We can't clear settlements. We can't reconcile the overnight batches. Half of Asia is screaming at us. And then he noticed me. He froze, like I was a grenade with the pin half pulled. The CEO's son, the same one who'd decided I was past my relevance window, stood at the conference table with his arms crossed, pretending not to be panicking. He avoided eye contact. Good. He remembered yesterday. I sat down, opened my laptop, and calmly began sorting through the code that a dozen contractors had butchered like they were carving a turkey in the dark. COBOL isn't glamorous. It's not new. It doesn't make 22-year-olds at tech conferences clap. But this bank ran on it. Always had. And I knew every subsystem like I knew my own heartbeat. That was the problem for management. The guy they thought was obsolete turned out to be the only thing standing between them and regulatory collapse. While I typed, the CEO kept glancing at me like she was trying to decide whether to thank me or fire her own son. Her jaw tightened each time another critical system failed to respond. Her son began pacing, muttering excuses under his breath, trying to blame legacy inefficiencies and resource mismatch. But every executive in that room knew the truth. He'd fired the one man who understood the machine he was now drowning under. I let them stew a little longer before speaking. Your overnight jobs crashed because the patch you approved was never validated against the core batch scheduler. It created a deadlock loop. The longer it runs, the worse it gets. The COO sputtered. The CEO rubbed her temples. The son opened his mouth like he might object, but nothing came out. I looked directly at him. This is why you don't fire the guy who built half the workflows you still rely on. Especially not for age optics. For the next 3 hours, I repaired what their shiny new consultants had broken. Field by field. Routine by routine. When I finally pushed the corrected load back into production and saw the green light ripple across the dashboard like dawn breaking, the whole room exhaled. I sat back, hands folded, while the executives whispered furiously among themselves. They knew exactly what had happened. They just didn't know how to dig themselves out politically. The CEO finally approached me. Her expression was equal parts gratitude and dread. "We'd like you to return," she said. "In a consulting capacity." "Whatever rate you, 20,000 an hour," I said without blinking. The room froze. Her son nearly choked. I shrugged. If you want the system modernized, stable, and future-proofed, you need someone who understands its bones. And bones take decades to learn. She didn't even argue. She just nodded, defeated. I packed up my laptop and stood. For the first time since I'd returned, the CEO's son finally met my eyes. Not with arrogance, no. with the hollow, dawning recognition that he'd made a mistake so expensive it would echo through board meetings for years. I walked to the elevator while the entire executive floor watched in silence. Corporate chess? Checkmate. He didn't even try to lower his voice when he said it. Look, we need fresh energy around here. People who get modern systems. Not. His eyes flicked to my gray hair. Legacy. Legacy. That was the word they used for the systems I'd kept alive for 3 decades. The word they used for the code that carried half of America's direct deposits every Friday. The word they used for me. I sat across from the newly hired VP of Digital Transformation, a man who'd never transformed anything except his resume, and listened to him explain why a bank that still ran mission-critical operations on a 1970s mainframe was letting go of its last senior COBOL engineer. They were moving to the cloud, he said. They were modernizing. They were eliminating dependency on outdated specialists. He was so proud of the decision he didn't even notice the tremor in the wall display behind him, the dashboard I'd built years ago, quietly turning from green to yellow. And then to red. I leaned back, folded my hands, and waited. He was still mid-sentence about future-proofing when his phone buzzed violently. Then again. Then again. He tried to ignore it until his smartwatch lit up with a notification large enough for me to see upside down. Core clearing failure, priority 1 multiple branches unable to process transactions. His face drained. Another alert hit. And another. The meeting room door slammed open. The COO rushed in, hair wild, tie crooked, eyes furious. Why the hell is the settlement system down? He barked. We have wires stuck mid-route across 7 states. The VP blinked like a stunned deer. I don't know, the migration team said. I stood, smoothing my shirt. You initiated the weekend cutover without validating the fallback jobs. The VP spun toward me. What? No, the consultants assured us. I cut him off. Your consultants don't know COBOL. They don't know JCL. They don't know the overnight batch ecosystem that moves $4 billion before sunrise. I tapped the desk. But I do. The COO turned to me like a drowning man seeing a life raft. Can you fix it? I pretended to think, just for a breath. Just long enough for the VP to experience the full weight of his mistake. I can, I finally said. But this isn't a 10-minute issue. You triggered a cascading rollback. The system's trying to reconcile mismatched ledgers in 3 regions. The VP swallowed. How long? I met the COO's eyes. At my contracting rate? About $20,000 an hour. Hazard premium included. The COO didn't even blink. Done. Start now. The VP sputtered. You can't, he was just let go, but the COO's glare shut him up instantly. I picked up my mug, my retirement mug, ironically, and headed for the mainframe room while a small entourage trailed behind me like nervous interns. Inside the cold hum of the data center, I slid into the operator chair the way a surgeon steps into an operating theater. Green on black terminals. Command screens no modern developer had ever seen. Systems older than half the employees upstairs. My hands moved on muscle memory. Restart dead jobs. Requie pending settlements. Patch the corrupted transfer table. Force a manual ledger reconcile. The moment I executed the final command, the alarm stopped. A soft chime rang across every monitor. System stable, all regions online. I leaned back and exhaled. Behind me, the COO whispered, "You just saved this bank." I nodded. Again. The VP's face was the color of sour milk. It took less than 48 hours. He wasn't just removed from the modernization project, he was escorted out of the building. HR called me the next morning. Given the recent events, they said, we'd like to offer you a full-time senior consultant role. Set your own hours. Your rate is approved. I smiled. Sounds good. But let's get one thing clear, I said. I'm not legacy. I paused, letting them sit with it. I'm the reason your legacy still works. And just like that, age discrimination cost them a VP, and made me the highest paid person in the company. He called me obsolete before he even learned my name. That was the hook, the one sentence that told me exactly what kind of boy wonder executive I was dealing with. Fresh MBA shine, suit too slim, haircut too expensive, confidence built entirely on PowerPoints and LinkedIn quotes. He'd been hired to modernize the bank's legacy systems, which apparently began with firing anyone who remembered life before cloud computing. I'd been writing COBOL since before his parents met. 42 years of patching, upgrading, stabilizing, and resuscitating systems that processed more money in a day than he'd see in 10 lifetimes. But to him, I was just the old guy in the basement. A liability. A line item. The termination meeting lasted 3 minutes. We're moving toward a younger, more agile workforce, he said, as if reading from a manual titled How to Accidentally Commit Illegal Workplace Discrimination. Behind him, HR nodded like a metronome. They offered me a severance package that was both insulting and hilarious, considering I could have retired 3 times by now. I didn't argue. I didn't educate. I didn't remind them that every major subsystem depended on code I personally built. I simply stood, shook hands, and walked out, quietly, politely, with the calm of a man who'd seen this exact movie 100 times. But the thing about legacy systems is this: they don't care how modern you think you are. They care who understands them well enough to keep them alive. And their new golden boy? He didn't understand a damn thing. By the time the sun set that Friday, the bank looked less like a financial institution and more like a burning circus, except no one knew where the fire started or who was holding the match. I watched from my quiet home office as my inbox flooded with increasingly frantic emails from directors, auditors, and finally the CFO himself, all asking the same question in progressively desperate tones. Can you take a look at something? Of course I could. I had been doing exactly that for 31 years. But now I charge $20,000 an hour, because apparently that's what expertise is worth when you spend a decade replacing it with youthful synergy. They had spent months telling me I was behind the times. That I didn't collaborate enough. That my skill set was too niche. In other words, too old, too expensive, too unreplaceable, so they tried anyway. When they finally forced me out, clean desk, cardboard box, fake smiles, I didn't argue. I didn't warn them. I didn't even remind them that 70% of their core systems still ran on the mainframe architecture I wrote back when the current CTO was learning cursive. But now those same mainframes were screaming. Not crashing, screaming. COBOL loops running hot. Batch sequences stuck mid-cycle. Settlement logic misfiring. The whole clearinghouse queue was seizing like an engine with no oil. And if the midnight run failed? Every trade for that day, every deposit, withdrawal, transfer, would become a legal catastrophe. They had exactly 6 hours before the regulators noticed. For before the international exchanges did. And probably an hour before the press got wind of it. I stared at the CFO's final email, name your rate. Just please fix it. I didn't reply immediately. I let the panic simmer. Let them taste the consequences of fresh perspectives. Then I typed, $20,000/HR minimum 10 hours billed. Prepayment required. The bank wire hit my account in 6 minutes. When I logged into the system they'd revoked me from months earlier, I had to laugh. They had hired a digital modernization firm, barely 2 years old, staffed by boot camp grads, who were confidently patching my 1989 transaction engine like it was a JavaScript widget. Their changes were elegant, sleek, syntactically beautiful, and structurally catastrophic. Like polishing a bomb. I rolled up my sleeves, the same way I had every night for decades, and got to work. And in those first critical minutes, it became clear what had happened. They fired the chess master but kept the enthusiastic checkers players. I rewrote the broken logic, sealed the bypasses they didn't understand, restored the batch queue, purged the corrupted ledger entries, and re-indexed the settlement files. Things no one under 35 even knew existed, much less how to repair. At 11:58 p.m., 2 minutes before everything detonated, the system hummed to life. The mainframe I'd known for half my life greeted me like an old friend. I sent one final message, resolved. Have a good weekend. The CFO replied in 60 seconds, we want you back, full-time. Any salary. Any title. Just say the number. I closed the laptop slowly. They didn't understand that this was never about money. They'd made it clear exactly what they thought of me. So I wrote the truth, you don't need an employee. You need an expert. And I remained exactly that, very independent, very expensive, and very in demand. Age discrimination had backfired so hard it became their most costly line item. Corporate chess, not checkers. And I never even had to flip the board.